In this session, we're going to be talking about the dual-authored nature of Scripture. And as by way of introduction, what we believe about the Bible is very important in our interpretation. We're talking about the distinction between the theology in the Bible and the theology of the Bible. Theology in the Bible is the Bible's theological statements about God and Jesus and so on. But by contrast, the theology of the Bible is what we believe about the Bible itself. Now, most Christian churches have some kind of written statement about what they believe about the Bible. For example, the Church of the Nazarene, in its Article of Faith on Scripture, says, "We believe in the plenary inspiration of the Holy Scriptures, by which we understand the 66 books of the Old and New Testaments, given by divine inspiration, inerrantly revealing the will of God concerning us in all things necessary to our salvation, so that whatever is not contained therein is not to be enjoined as an article of faith." Now, we won't unpack that statement now, but what is important to note is that God inspired the writing. And when we talk about the word inspiration, we can break it up into three parts. Inspiration. And with the Latin root of this word suggests that breathing life into something. This is similar to the idea in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, a famous text from the New Testament about the inspiration of Scripture. It says that every Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for training, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the person dedicated to God may be capable and equipped for every good work. The Greek word that's translated inspired in this passage is theopneustos, which means God breathed. So the Christians believe that the human writers of the Bible were inspired by God, although we disagree about what exactly inspiration means. And I hope those are friendly disagreements, at least they should be. On one extreme, some believe that God inspired every word or even every letter of the Bible to be written exactly as it appears. This is called the verbal inspiration or the dictation theory of inspiration. On the opposite extreme, some believe that God inspired the message in very general terms, and the human authors were completely free to write it down however they saw fit. And both of these extreme options, and also all different variations of them in between, agree that God inspired Scripture. One should emphasize the fact of inspiration, on which we all should agree, rather than the manner of inspiration, on which we should recognize some freedom to disagree. And a third way to look at the inspiration of Scripture is to suggest that God inspired not only the writers of Scripture, but also the readers of Scripture. Or, in other words, the inspiration of Scripture does not end with the end of the writing of Scripture. Now, all reading is an act of interpretation. None of us comes to reading anything, whether it's the Bible or the daily newspaper, without any assumptions, without any of our history, without any of our personal experiences and these kinds of things. But so the difference is whether it is good interpretation or poor interpretation. When we consider how we experience time as opposed to how God experiences time, humans experience time as a line that's stretching off into the future. And we have some events that we call in the past and some events that we look forward to that we call in the future. So, for example, the Exodus from Egypt is an event in the past, and the second coming of Jesus is an event in the future, and those are distinct in our experience. How God experiences time, however, is quite different from how we experience time. God is eternal, or outside of time, which means that every event is present to God immediately, right now. So right now, in God's experience, God is present at the time of the Exodus. And right now, God is present at the time of the second coming of Jesus, whenever that will be. And right now, God is present at the moment of your birth. God experiences all of these events at the same time. And to illustrate what I mean about how God inspires both the writing and the reading of Scripture, I can direct your attention to one passage from the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 7, verses 10 through 14, and one passage from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verses 20 through 23. I won't read those right now, but you can. They're familiar enough anyway. But you can take your time to read them on your own. But when we read these two passages, we can see that Matthew interpreted or reinterpreted Isaiah's prophecy as a prediction of Jesus. So when we see this, that raises the question, was Isaiah predicting the birth of Jesus in this passage? And when we think about it, no, we realize that no, Isaiah was not predicting Jesus, because Isaiah was preaching for his own situation, and his disciples, or whoever they were, that remembered his preaching and brought it together in what we now call the book of Isaiah, were writing for their particular situation. The prophecy that Isaiah gives in chapter 7 is fulfilled. The promise was kept, and God was once again proved to be reliable. Now, Matthew comes along and he reinterprets Isaiah's prophecy as a prediction of Jesus. So this raises the question, is Matthew committing a foul in interpretation? Is Matthew doing this thing that we call eisegesis, which is reading his own meaning back into the text from Isaiah, which is the opposite of exegesis, letting Isaiah's meaning dictate how we understand the passage? And when we think about that, we realize that no, of course not. Of course, Matthew is not committing eisegesis with Isaiah. But Matthew was writing for his situation. And he was writing in order to explain the birth of a very important baby. And he found in Scripture, and of course for Matthew, Scripture was what we now call the Old Testament. He found in Scripture a sign of a baby being born. Now when we take a look at some of the differences between Isaiah 7 and Matthew 1, we see first they're similar in that Isaiah was preaching for his situation, and Matthew in a way was preaching for his situation. But the differences are readily apparent. First of all, they're 700 years apart in time. And for Isaiah, the birth of the baby was the sign of the deliverance. Whereas for Matthew, the baby was himself the agent of deliverance. So we remember how God experiences time. God is eternal, outside of time. And every event on the timeline is present for God. The birth of Jesus is a present moment for God right now. And also Isaiah preaching about the deliverance to King Ahaz that's just about to come is a present moment for God right now. God's inspiration of Scripture works along the entire process. God inspires the writing of Scripture and the reading or interpretation of Scripture. And remember that all reading is an act of interpretation. Isaiah is an inspired writer of Scripture. Matthew is an inspired reader or interpreter of Scripture and an inspired writer of Scripture. And you and I, we are inspired readers or interpreters of Scripture. Of course, we're not writing Scripture anymore. The Bible is complete as we have it in the Old and New Testaments. But God's inspiration still continues on, even to this day. So to conclude this, we say again that God is involved in the entire process. Matthew saw in Isaiah's prophecy a way to explain the birth of Jesus. And Isaiah's prophecy, once it was fulfilled, needed reinterpretation in order to be continually relevant. It was an important story of how God had delivered in the past. But in order to be more than that, he needed Matthew to come along and reinterpret the prophecy. And both of them are inspired readers and writers of Scripture. Both understandings are correct. God inspires both the writers and the readers of the gospel, the good news. And this is what the second part of 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 is all about. Every Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the person dedicated to God may be capable and equipped for every good work.